The first thing you hear in hell is a siren, not the fire and brimstone eternal damnation kind of hell. This one is worse. It's beige. It's called Serenity Meadows Estates. And the sound of that ambulance siren was the first interesting thing to happen in the 3 weeks I'd lived here. It was a shrill, desperate cry that didn't belong among the perfectly manicured lawns and the unsettlingly identical mailboxes. I was in my sterile home office, trying to coax a Wi-Fi signal stronger than a whisper out of the local infrastructure, when the sound sliced through the oppressive quiet. It grew closer, Dopplering up in pitch until it was right outside. I glanced out the window, my lukewarm coffee pausing halfway to my lips. A pediatric ambulance, its lights painting the beige houses in frantic splashes of red and blue, had stopped dead at the entrance to our little cul-de-sac. And standing in front of it, arms crossed like a 5-foot-4-inch garden gnome of pure spite, was a woman. I didn't need an introduction. I knew exactly who she was. This was Carol Whitmire, HOA president, supreme ruler of this little fiefdom, and the reason my recycling bin had its own demerit file. I couldn't hear the words at first, just the angry tone. I slid the window open, the cool evening air carrying their voices. "Ma'am, I need you to move. Now." The paramedic speaking was a young guy, his voice tight with a tension that was clearly past the point of professional courtesy. "We have a pediatric patient with a severe respiratory emergency. The Turner's house, end of the street." Carol didn't budge. She adjusted the cardigan draped over her shoulders, a weaponized garment of pastel pink. "And I have told you," she said, her voice carrying a nasal authority that could curdle milk, "that this heavy vehicle is not permitted on the newly resealed private drive. It will leave tire marks and compromise the substrate. The bylaws are explicitly clear. You are to use the designated service entrance." The paramedic stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief. "The service entrance is over a mile back. We don't have time for that. We are talking about a child who cannot breathe." Then the child's parents should have considered the emergency vehicle access routes when they purchased their home, Carol retorted, without a flicker of irony or humanity. "The rules are for everyone's benefit. They preserve our property values." I felt something cold and sharp crystallize in my chest. For the last 5 years, I'd been the CEO of a logistics company that used predictive AI to solve impossibly complex shipping problems. My entire life had been about optimizing systems, removing bottlenecks, and finding the most efficient path from A to B. And standing right there, blocking a literal path of life, was the most inefficient, illogical, and infuriating bottleneck I had ever seen. The paramedic was pleading now. "Ma'am, for the love of God, it's a little girl." Carol simply pointed a perfectly manicured finger at a small, metal sign I'd never noticed before. "Serenity Meadows, HOA, no unauthorized commercial or heavy vehicles. Violators will be fined." That was it. My brain, which I had been trying so hard to switch off for the past 3 weeks, booted up with a vengeance. Problem: immovable object, Carol, powered by delusions of grandeur, versus a time-sensitive medical emergency. Constraint: physical altercation is suboptimal. Legal debate is too slow. Objective: get paramedics and their equipment from point A, ambulance, to point B, patient's house, in the shortest possible time. Solution: introduce a variable that renders the primary obstacle, the ground route, completely irrelevant. I turned from the window, my mind already executing the plan. I walked calmly to my desk, picked up my phone, and hit a single name on my favorites list. It rang once. "Tony. Tony," I said, my voice flat. "I need the bird, my place, 5 minutes." "On my way, boss," he replied. No questions. Tony was good like that. I walked back to the window. The argument was still raging, a pointless feedback loop of desperation versus bureaucracy. I felt a strange sense of detachment, the way I used to feel before a hostile takeover negotiation. The board was set, the pieces were moving. 3 minutes later it started, a faint whoomp, whoomp, whoomp in the distance. It was a sound that didn't belong here any more than the siren did. It grew steadily, a deep, rhythmic heartbeat that vibrated through the window pane. Heads started turning. The neighbors, drawn out by the siren, were now looking up at the sky, their faces etched with confusion. Carol paused her lecture, a flicker of annoyance on her face at being interrupted. The sound became a roar. A shadow fell over the cul-de-sac as a sleek, black, Augusta AW-109 helicopter, my beautiful, obnoxious, gloriously unnecessary bird, crested the line of perfectly symmetrical crepe myrtles. I walked out my front door, onto my HOA-compliant porch, and strolled into the middle of the street. The rotor wash hit first, a physical wave of force that blasted through the sterile air. It whipped Carol's prized cardigan into a frenzy and sent her perfectly coiffed hair streaming sideways like she'd stuck her finger in a light socket. A blizzard of her award-winning petunia petals swirled through the air. Decorative mulch, the exact shade of brown mandated by Rule 114C, scattered across the pristine asphalt. Tony, a former Special Forces pilot who now flew me to meetings to avoid traffic, hovered expertly for a moment. I gave him a simple, circular gesture with my hand. He nodded, and with a grace that defied its size, the helicopter descended, its skids kissing the ground in the exact center of the cul-de-sac, not 10 feet from the ambulance's front bumper. The roar subsided to a powerful hum. The side door slid open. I turned to the 2 paramedics who were staring, jaws slack, at the impossible machine that had just landed in their suburban nightmare. "Need a lift?" I asked, my voice calm. For a moment, they just stared. Then, the one who'd been arguing with Carol snapped into action. "You're serious?" "As a heart attack," I said, "which we're trying to prevent. Let's go." They didn't need to be told twice. They grabbed their jump bags and the portable oxygen from the ambulance. The second paramedic ran to the Turners' front door, and moments later they were helping Mr. Turner carry his small daughter, wrapped in a blanket, toward the helicopter. I watched them load her in, the little girl so tiny against the backdrop of the machine. The lead paramedic grabbed my arm, his eyes wide with a combination of shock and profound gratitude. "I don't know who you are, but thank you." "Liam Sterling," I said, shaking his hand. "Your new neighbor." As the door slid shut, I turned to look at Carol. She was speechless, her mouth opening and closing like a beached carp. Her face was a glorious mural of outrage. Before the helicopter lifted off, I leaned toward her, just enough to be heard over the whining turbines. "Send me the bill for the asphalt," I said. Then, with a final, deafening roar, the bird was airborne, banking gracefully over the rooftops and heading toward the hospital. It left behind a stunned, wind-swept silence, a scattering of ruined foliage, and one apoplectic HOA president standing alone in the middle of her suddenly imperfect kingdom. The police arrived 7 minutes later. By then, the entire neighborhood was outside, whispering in huddled groups, pointing at the sky, and then at me. I was sitting on my front steps, finally sipping my now cold coffee. The officer who approached me was a man in his late 40s, with tired eyes and a name tag that read Miller. He looked from me to the trembling, screeching form of Carol, then back to me, and sighed the sigh of a man who knew this was going to be a very long report. "Evening," he said. "Mind telling me what in the Sam Hill just happened here?" "Evening, officer," I replied calmly. "Emergency medical transport. A child was having trouble breathing, and her access to care was being obstructed. So I provided an alternative transport solution. Carol stormed over, a whirlwind of indignation. He landed a helicopter, in the middle of our street. It's a violation of FAA regulations, city ordinances, and about 50 different HOA bylaws. Look at my petunias. He blew them all away. Officer Miller held up a hand. Ma'am, let me handle this. Sir, you have a pilot's license for that thing? My pilot does, I said, pulling out my phone. I can provide you with his license, the aircraft's registration, N number, and the flight path he logged with the local tower for the emergency pickup. It's all perfectly legal. I showed him the documents on my screen. He squinted at the phone, then looked around the cul-de-sac. You can't just land a helicopter in a residential neighborhood. You can, actually, I corrected gently. In a legitimate medical emergency, a pilot has broad discretion. It's considered a point of necessity landing, given that the alternative was letting a child suffocate while she, I gestured to Carol, was arguing about tire marks. I think any judge would agree it was a reasonable course of action. Miller's eyes flickered toward Carol, a glimmer of understanding in their weary depths. He knew exactly what he was dealing with. "Arrest him!" Carol shrieked. "For what, ma'am?" Miller asked, his patience fraying. "Saving a child's life? My hands are tied here. This is a civil matter and an FAA matter, and they can take it up with his pilot. My advice to you is to talk to your neighbor." He gave me a look that was 1 part warning and 2 parts grudging respect. "Try to keep the aviation incidents to a minimum, sir." He tipped his cap and walked back to his cruiser, leaving me alone with the sputtering rage of Carol Whitmire. This was when I got my first real glimpse into the abyss. This was also when I began to understand how I had ended up in this beige, rule-obsessed purgatory in the first place. I had been looking for peace. After selling my company, Loginext AI, for a sum that the media described as eye-watering, all I wanted was quiet. I was done with 100-hour weeks, with venture capitalists breathing down my neck, with the constant pressure to innovate or die. I wanted a place where the biggest decision of my day was what to have for dinner. A real estate agent, a slick woman with teeth so white they were a fire hazard, had sold me on Serenity Meadows. "It's the pinnacle of peaceful, orderly living," she'd cooed. Orderly was one word for it. Oppressive was another. The day I moved in, I'd received a welcome basket. It contained a bottle of non-alcoholic sparkling cider, a single beige muffin, and a 3-ring binder so thick it could have stopped a bullet. It was the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, or as I came to call it, the holy text of the Beige Inquisition. I'd flipped through it that first night, laughing. Rule 27. All garden gnomes must be of a classical, non-whimsical design and may not exceed 12 inches in height. Rule 88. Holiday decorations may not be erected more than 14 days prior to the holiday and must be removed within 7 days following. Rule 112. If. The color of all exterior window shutters must be chosen from the pre-approved palette, 3 shades of dark green, and a color called Midnight Despair, which was basically black. My first run-in with Carol had been over my recycling bin. I'd put it on the curb, and she had materialized from thin air, clipboard in hand. She informed me, with the gravity of a surgeon diagnosing a terminal illness, that my bin was 6 inches too close to the curb, a clear violation of Guideline 14C, subsection to 2. I had stared at her, then at the bin, then back at her, and moved it exactly 6 inches with the most deadpan expression I could muster. She'd made a note on her clipboard and vanished. Now, standing in the aftermath of my aerial intervention, I realized my mistake. I had treated Carol and her rulebook as a joke, but to her, it was gospel. I had not just broken a rule. I had committed heresy. I had dropped a noisy, chaotic, life-saving miracle right in the middle of her perfectly ordered, soulless church. The next morning it began. Taped to my front door was a crisp, cream-colored envelope. Inside, on thick cardstock, was an official HOA violation notice. Violation: unauthorized landing of aircraft on common ground. Fine: $500. Violation: destruction of HOA-maintained flora, petunias. Fine: $200. Violation: excessive noise during designated quiet hours. Fine: $100. Violation: creation of a public nuisance. Fine: $250. A total of $1,050 in fines. I looked at the notice. I looked at my bland, beige house, a house I'd bought for its supposed tranquility. I looked across the street at Carol's house, where she was already outside, meticulously re-edging her lawn. A slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. She wanted a war of paperwork and fines, a war fought with rules and regulations. Fine, I could play that game. But I wasn't going to fight with paper. I was going to fight with steel, concrete, and an obscene amount of cash. My phone was already in my hand. I wasn't Googling lawyers. Not yet. First, I needed an architect. No, not an architect. I needed a co-conspirator. My search history was simple. Contractors who hate HOAs. The first 3 contractors I interviewed were useless. They took one look at the HOA binder, their faces paled, and they started muttering about architectural review committees and material restrictions. They were beaten men, their spirits crushed by years of fighting over approved shades of taupe. Then, on the 4th interview, a beat-up Ford F-250 that looked like it had been used to ram-raid a Home Depot rumbled up my driveway. The man who climbed out was a mountain. He had to be 6'5", with a barrel chest, a glorious salt and pepper beard, and hands the size of dinner plates. He wore a dusty Carhartt jacket and a look of cheerful cynicism. "Liam Sterling," he boomed, his voice like gravel in a rock tumbler. "Mike Kowalski, you're the guy who landed the chopper?" "The one and only," I said, shaking his massive hand. "Come on in." I sat him down at my dining room table and pushed the HOA binder toward him. He looked at it like it was a coiled snake. "I've seen bigger," he grunted, but without conviction. "Mike, I'm going to be straight with you," I said, leaning forward. "I have a neighbor problem. She runs this place like a gulag. I want to build something. Something big, something expressive. The other guys I talked to ran screaming." Mike leaned back, a slow grin spreading across his face, revealing a gold tooth. "Son, you haven't seen me run from anything but my ex-wife's lawyer. What are we talking about? I want to build a 3-story, state-of-the-art workshop and garage. Steel frame, glass walls, full solar roof, maybe a car lift. I want it attached right here." I pointed out the window to the side of my house, the side that directly faced Carol's living room. I want it to be the most beautiful, modern, and aggressively non-beige thing this neighborhood has ever seen. Mike was quiet for a full minute. He stared out the window, his eyes narrowing. He looked at the binder, then back at me. I could see the gears turning in his head, the calculations being made, not of cost, but of pure, unadulterated potential for glorious mayhem. "You're not looking for a contractor," he finally said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You're looking for an artist. What you want to build isn't a garage, Mr. Sterling. It's a monument, a glorious multi-level middle finger made of architectural brilliance." I grinned. "You're hired? Call me Big Mike," he boomed, slapping the table so hard the water glasses jumped. "Now let's look at the scriptures." For the next 3 hours, Big Mike and I huddled over the HOA bylaws like 2 generals planning an invasion. It was a masterclass in malicious compliance. "Okay, Article 9, Section 4, Mike read, tracing the line with a thick finger. No outbuilding or attached structure shall exceed 2 stories or 24 feet in height, whichever is less. Problematic, I noted. Nah, Mike waved a dismissive hand. It says stories, but it doesn't define a story's height. We'll build 2 stories, but there'll be 14-foot stories with a mezzanine level in the top one that doesn't count as a full floor. And for the height, we grade the land down 2 feet before we pour the foundation. The roofline will be exactly 23 feet, 11 inches from the new ground level. Perfectly compliant. The materials list, I said, flipping a page. It bans vinyl siding, untreated wood, corrugated metal. But it doesn't ban architectural steel, reinforced concrete, or triple-paned UV-coated smart glass. Mike shot back, his eyes gleaming. They never conceived of anyone having the budget for it. We'll build a fortress of awesomeness. The color palette was our masterpiece of pettiness. The approved list was a depressing rainbow of beige, taupe, off-white, and a sad-looking gray. What about the steel frame? I asked. It needs to be painted. Mike grinned. Leave that to me. He pulled out his phone and, after a few minutes of searching, slammed it on the table. There. It's an industrial coating. Its official manufacturer name is Architectural Neutrality, but the product code is ANBLK 9000. It's the blackest paint commercially available. It absorbs 99.8% of visible light. Is it on the approved list? Nope, but more importantly, it's not on the banned list. Its name is Architectural Neutrality. How can they argue with that? It's the most neutral a color can be. The project was officially christened the Carroll Wing. While Big Mike started drawing up the plans, my next call was to my lawyer. Arthur Finch was a man who communicated primarily through itemized invoices. He was a shark in a $1,000 suit who found loopholes the way a truffle pig finds truffles. Arthur, I said, pacing my office, I'm about to engage in some spirited home renovation. Spirited? He purred into the phone, the sound of billable hours starting to chime in the background. Is this related to the aeronautical incident I read about in the police blotter? Tangentially, I admitted. I'm sending you the HOA bylaws. I need you to file all the necessary permits with the city and the HOA's Architectural Review Committee. I want it all so airtight, so legally unassailable, that God himself couldn't find a reason to deny it. Consider it done, Liam, Arthur said. I do love a good textualist argument. While the lawyers and engineers did their work, Carol began her offensive. It was a death by 1,000 paper cuts. A notice for my grass being a 1/4 inch over the mandated 4-inch maximum. I responded by hiring a landscaping crew to come twice a week. They used a laser level to ensure perfect uniformity. A fine for my trash cans being left on the curb for 10 minutes past the 7 p.m. deadline. I responded by commissioning a local robotics hobbyist to build a small, automated platform that would detect the garbage truck's departure via a sensor and automatically roll my bins back into the garage. It was a $5,000 solution to a $50 problem, and it was worth every penny just to imagine the look on Carol's face. My next-door neighbor, a quiet retiree named Brenda, whose prize-winning roses were her only form of rebellion, watched all of this from her window. One afternoon, as I was testing the trash can bot, she shuffled over. "You're really doing it, aren't you?" she whispered, her eyes wide. "Doing what, Brenda?" "Poking the bear." She leaned closer. "She made me dig up my yellow roses last year. Said they were garish and not in keeping with the neighborhood's subdued floral aesthetic." "Brenda," I said, putting a hand on her shoulder. "The bear is about to get poked with a 50-ton excavator." A tiny, brave smile touched her lips. "Godspeed," she whispered, before scuttling back to her house. The resistance had its first member. The day the permits cleared was a day that will live in Serenity Meadows' infamy. Arthur called me, sounding smug. They approved it, Liam. They had no choice. The plans are flawless. They tried to deny it based on aesthetic disharmony, but as I pointed out in my rebuttal letter, aesthetic harmony is a legally subjective and unenforceable standard. The next morning, it arrived. A lowboy truck rumbled down the street, carrying a yellow Caterpillar 336 excavator. Big Mike was there to meet it, directing the driver with the joyous authority of a king, returning to his castle. The machine crawled off the truck and onto my lawn, my perfectly manicured, laser-leveled lawn, and left 2 massive tread marks in its wake. It was beautiful. Big Mike climbed into the cab, gave me a thumbs up, and with a deafening roar of diesel-powered fury, plunged the bucket into the earth. The ground shook. A great scoop of dirt and grass was lifted into the air. The construction of the Carroll wing had officially begun. Of course, my phone rang. It was Officer Miller. "Liam," he said, and I could hear the exhaustion in his voice. "I'm getting a call about some unapproved excavation." "It's fully approved, officer," I said cheerfully. "I have the permits right here. Laminated." There was a long pause. "Laminated," he repeated flatly. "Leather-bound portfolio, too. Arthur Finch doesn't mess around." "I'll be there in 5, he sighed. When Miller arrived, Carol was already in my yard, practically vibrating with rage. Big Mike had the excavator parked, its giant arm looming over her like a patient metal dinosaur. "He is destroying this neighborhood!" she shrieked at Miller. Miller ignored her and walked over to me. "Let's see the permits." I handed him the portfolio. He opened it and flipped through the pages, his eyebrows climbing higher with each stamp and signature. It contained city permits, soil reports, engineering diagrams, and the final, grudging approval letter from the HOA's own committee. He closed the portfolio and handed it back to me. He turned to Carol. "It's all in order, ma'am. He's allowed to build." But the noise, the dirt!" "It's a construction site, ma'am. They tend to have those," Miller said, his patience worn down to a single, trembling thread. "Please stop calling 911 for bylaw disputes. It's not an emergency." Carol stared, defeated for the moment. My first victory, that afternoon my first tactical move was deployed. Big Mike's crew erected a temporary construction fence. But I hadn't ordered flimsy chain link. Oh no. I had custom-ordered 8-foot-tall solid black composite panels. Within hours, a monolithic black wall stood between my property and Carol's, completely blocking her view. She could hear the construction, but she couldn't see it. For a woman whose power was derived from observation, it was the equivalent of being blinded. The war then entered a new, dirtier phase. A few days later, the crew arrived to find the graded area near her property line a giant mud pit. I checked the footage from the discrete high-definition security cameras I'd had installed. At 3 a.m., Carol's sprinkler system had come on, with 2 heads clearly re-aimed to spray directly over the fence. I smiled. Amateur. I didn't confront her. I didn't send a letter. I called my robotics guy. The next day, a new system was in place. That night, at 3 a.m., her sprinklers kicked on again. The moment my soil moisture sensors detected an anomalous reading, 2 things happened simultaneously. A waterproof Kevlar-reinforced tarp automatically deployed on a motorized track, shielding the entire construction site, and a military-grade 10,000 lumen spotlight, mounted on the roof of my house, snapped on, illuminating her property with the intensity of the midday sun. Simultaneously, a directional loudspeaker I'd hidden in a plastic birdhouse began to play a single sound on a loop, aimed directly at her bedroom window. A loud, obnoxious, quacking duck. The sprinkler stayed on for 15 minutes. The light and the duct stayed on for 15 minutes. Then they all shut off. The cops were not called. A small but significant win. The neighborhood was now firmly divided into two camps: the Carrollites, who saw me as the Antichrist in a Tesla, and the Resistance, a small but growing faction who secretly cheered my every move. Brenda was my primary source of intelligence, providing me with tidbits of gossip and historical grievances against Carol. The Gallaghers had to repaint their front door 3 times in 2018, she'd tell me in a hushed whisper over the fence. It went from forest green to hunter green to pine grove. Carol said the first 2 were too jaunty. Armed with this knowledge, I launched a charm offensive. I found out the Gallaghers had a son in college and anonymously sent them a gift card for his campus bookstore. I accidentally had too much pizza delivered from the best place in town and told the delivery guy to give the extra pies to the family 2 doors down, the one Carol had fined for having an unapproved basketball hoop. I was building political capital, one small act of kindness at a time. The frame of the Carol wing began to rise, a skeleton of black steel against the sky. It was magnificent and horrifying, depending on your perspective. Carol, unable to stop the construction legally, called for an emergency HOA meeting. Her goal was to whip the residents into a frenzy and pass a special resolution to halt my project based on the catch-all neighborhood nuisance clause. The meeting was held in the soulless community center, a room that smelled of stale coffee and shattered dreams. The fluorescent lights hummed over the sea of concerned, middle-aged faces. Carol stood at the front, dabbing at a dry eye with a tissue. She gave a performance worthy of an Oscar, a tearful, dramatic speech about the sanctity of their community, the threat to their property values, the monstrosity rising next door that was casting a dark shadow over their lives. Then, it was my turn. I didn't go to the podium. I stayed by my seat and clicked a button on a remote. A projector screen I'd had Big Mike install that afternoon whirred to life. "Good evening, everyone," I said calmly. "I know there are concerns, so instead of giving a speech, I'd like to present some data." My first slide was a 3D rendering of the completed project. It was, I had to admit, stunning, a marvel of modern design. There were gasps. "I know it's a departure from the current aesthetic," I continued, "but let's talk about compliance." The next slide was a checklist. Height, materials, color, setbacks, all with a big green check mark next to them, citing the exact bylaw and the approval documents. Now, let's talk about property values. The next slide showed a market analysis from a top real estate firm projecting that the addition of a unique, architect-designed home would actually increase the value and desirability of the entire cul-de-sac. More murmurs. "But I know this project has been disruptive," I said, my voice turning earnest. "And I want to be a good neighbor. I want to give back to the community." Click. The next slide showed a detailed schematic of the solar panel array on the roof. "This system," I explained, "will generate approximately 150% of the energy my property requires. I've already spoken with the power company. I would like to donate the surplus energy directly to the HOA, which, according to my calculations, will reduce your common area maintenance fees by an average of 60%. The room erupted. People were turning to each other, whispering excitedly. Slashing the hated HOA fees was like promising a tax cut and a free puppy to every home. I saw Carol's face tighten. But I wasn't done. "And one more thing," I said, channeling my inner Steve Jobs. Click. The final slide appeared. It was a beautiful, photorealistic rendering of the dilapidated community park at the end of our development. But in the rendering, it wasn't dilapidated. It had a brand new state-of-the-art playground, a splash pad, new benches, and a barbecue area. "The park has been neglected for years," I said, my voice ringing through the silent room. "If the community will allow my project to proceed without further interruption, I will personally fund the complete renovation of the park to these exact specifications. Construction to begin the day the carol, my wing, is complete." Checkmate. You could feel the entire mood of the room shift. The debate was no longer about my monstrous garage. It was about lower fees and a new park for their kids. The parents in the room were practically drooling. Carol tried to argue. "You can't buy them off," she shrieked. A man in the back I'd never seen before stood up. "He's not buying me off, Carol. He's offering to fix the park you promised to fix 3 years ago. I'm voting to let him build." The vote wasn't even close. The motion to halt construction was defeated in a landslide. I packed up my laptop, gave a small nod to Brenda, and walked out into the cool night air, leaving the wreckage of Carol's political career behind me. The next few months were a blur of glorious, productive noise. Concrete was poured, steel was welded, and giant panes of glass were craned into place. Big Mike and his crew worked with the efficiency of a military unit, while I managed the project's tech integration from my office. Smart lighting, a distributed audio system, a climate control system managed by a custom AI. It was my masterpiece. Finally, the day came. The last truck rolled away, the last worker packed up his tools. The construction fence came down. The Carol wing was complete. It was breathtaking. The Vanta black steel frame seemed to drink the sunlight, and the massive glass walls reflected the sky and the trees, making the huge structure seem almost light. It was a stark, beautiful piece of modern art dropped into a world of beige. It was time for the grand finale. I planned a housewarming and project unveiling block party. I went all out. I hired a farm-to-table catering company, a string quartet to play classical arrangements of rock songs, and a bouncy castle that was, I made sure, 2 inches below the maximum allowable height for temporary structures. An invitation was printed on thick, elegant cardstock and hand-delivered to every single house in Serenity Meadows, including Carol's. I didn't know if she would come. Part of me hoped she would. The day of the party was perfect. The sun was shining, the food was incredible, and the neighborhood turned out in force. The kids were going wild in the bouncy castle. The parents were marveling at the free food and open bar. Big Mike was holding court by the barbecue, telling war stories about his battles with other HOAs. Even Officer Miller showed up, off duty, looking relaxed for the first time I'd ever seen him. He gave me a nod. "Quite the shindig, Sterling." "Just being neighborly," I said with a grin. Finally, the time came. I clinked a glass to get everyone's attention and stood on the new patio in front of the wing. "Thank you all for coming," I said. "I know this project was a bit of a shock to the system." A few people chuckled. "But now that it's done, I wanted to show you what it's all about." I saw her then. Carol. Standing at the very back of the crowd, her arms crossed, her face a thundercloud of resentment. "Perfect. The ground floor," I said, gesturing to the huge garage doors, "is my workshop, a place for me to tinker. The second floor is an entertainment space, a home theater. But the top floor is something different." I held up my phone. "I built this wing for a reason, and it started on a night a few months ago when an ambulance was stopped at the entrance to our street." A hush fell over the crowd. They all remembered. That night I realized our community had a vulnerability, a logistics problem, so I decided to solve it. I tapped a button on my phone. Above the top floor windows, a soft light began to glow, illuminating a beautifully crafted sign. The crowd read it aloud in a collective murmur. "The Serenity Meadows Pediatric Telehealth and Emergency Coordination Center." I let the words hang in the air for a moment before continuing. I have partnered with St. Jude's Children's Hospital, the very same hospital that little Gracie Turner was being rushed to that night. This top floor is a fully equipped pro bono telemedicine facility. I pointed to a separate, discreet entrance on the side of the building. Local families can book free remote consultations with top pediatric specialists from around the country right from here. Furthermore, it serves as a direct, high-tech dispatch link for any future medical emergencies in the development. We have a direct line to the county's 911 dispatch and the hospital. We can coordinate responses and ensure that help always arrives via the fastest possible route. Standing near the back were the two paramedics from that first night. They were smiling broadly. Mr. and Mrs. Turner were there too, with their daughter Gracie, now healthy and giggling. Mrs. Turner had tears streaming down her face. The crowd was silent for a beat, processing the information. They had all thought I was a selfish rich guy building a toy box. I had just revealed that my epic act of spite was also an incredible act of philanthropy. Then, the applause started. It wasn't polite clapping. It was a roar. It was an ovation. Brenda was openly weeping with joy. Big Mike was clapping me on the back so hard I thought he'd dislocate my shoulder. Officer Miller just stood there, shaking his head with a slow, broad smile. I looked for Carol. She was frozen, her face pale. She was trapped. How could she fight this? How could she rally against a free health clinic for sick children? Her entire platform, her entire identity was built on enforcing rules for the good of the community. I had just redefined what was good for the community in a way she could never, ever touch. She tried. She took a step forward, her mouth opening. "But the bylaws! You can't run a business from a residence," she stammered, her voice thin and reedy. No one was listening. Her voice was swallowed by the applause. A few of her former allies actively turned their backs on her. She had been rendered irrelevant. Her power, built on whispers and intimidation, had been annihilated by a grand gesture of public generosity. She stood there for another moment, her face crumbling. And then she turned, and all but fled the party. A ghost at a feast she could no longer control. A few weeks later, the annual HOA election was held. Carol didn't run. She didn't even show up. Her reign was over. Brenda, to her own profound shock, was nominated for president. She tried to decline, but a wave of support carried her forward. She won in a landslide. Her first act in office was to table a motion to form a committee to review, simplify, and humanize the Book of Bylaws. Carol's house went up for sale a month after that. The new owners were a young couple with 2 kids and a dog that barked. No one complained. I'm in my workshop now. The Carol wing is my sanctuary. The scent of oil and metal has replaced the sterile potpourri of the model home. Through the giant glass wall, I can see the neighborhood. It's different now. The eerie silence has been replaced by the sound of kids laughing in the new playground. Neighbors are actually stopping to talk to each other on the street. The oppressive, uniform beige is slowly being chipped away, replaced by the chaotic, vibrant colors of an actual community. I came here looking for a quiet life, a place to switch off. Instead, I started a war. But it turns out, sometimes the only way to find peace is to fight for it. Sometimes, to build something beautiful, you first have to tear down the management, one ridiculously over-engineered, maliciously compliant, gloriously spiteful act at a time. I take a sip of my coffee, and for the first time since I moved in, Serenity Meadows feels like home.